Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jack.
Sunday was January 25th, and there's a specific history for Connecticut tied to that date. On January 25th, 1663 in Hartford, a diary recorded a mild temperature winter day with deep snow covering the ground. 3 people were led to the gallows on this snowy day: Mary Barnes, Rebecca Greensmith, and Nathaniel Greensmith. Mary Barnes is considered the last person executed for witchcraft in Connecticut, but her story, and really all of their stories, didn't start on this day at the gallows.
It did start with fear, with the absence of leadership, and with the community at the edge of the Puritan frontier and in crisis. Today we're talking about the Hartford witch panic of 1662 and 1663, not just the trials themselves, but as much as possible, the real people caught in them and the circumstances that made this tragedy unfold.
Before Salem became synonymous with witch hunts in America, Connecticut had already established itself as the deadliest colony for witchcraft prosecutions.
The numbers truly tell the story. There were 11 executions in Connecticut between 1647 and 1663. During that same period, there were only 4 in Massachusetts. Connecticut set a pace for New England for witch prosecutions.
It all began with Alice Young, the first person hanged for witchcraft in the American colonies. She was hanged in Hartford, Connecticut on May 26, 1647, but she came from Windsor, Connecticut, up the river. That same year, 1647, Thomas Hooker, Hartford's founder, had died during an influenza epidemic. And there was a pattern of disease, death, and desperation in Windsor. You can look at Alice Young's neighbors. Many of them lost children or themselves perished in this epidemic, but Alice and her one daughter survived. As we mentioned, this was occurring on a frontier. Connecticut was the New England frontier. To the west of it was New Netherland, owned by the Dutch. And all around, there were different Native American groups. And the people of Connecticut, the English settlers, they were at odds with these groups quite often. And there was a lot of fear that both the Dutch and the Native Americans would turn against the English and devastate them. So they had this war in 1637, which really decimated the Pequots. And one of the leaders of it was Captain John Mason of Connecticut. He led Connecticut forces. He's responsible for at least one massacre. And the same guy, John Mason, went on to be the deputy governor. He was deputy governor during a 1662 to 1663 witch panic in Hartford.
Today, his statue is in Windsor, Connecticut.
We've talked a lot about Salem, how there was this siege mentality in Salem, being surrounded by, you have the French and Native American groups there. And then in Connecticut, it's Dutch and Native American groups. And so you have this feeling that you're beset by forces opposed to English Puritanism surrounding these 2 colonies. And they really felt that between those human threats and the presence of the devil that they felt was really strong in the Northeast of America, they really felt that they were under threat all the time.
So they had this outside threat, and then the sickness sweeps through. And one of the ways it appears that they may have tried to resolve it was a witch execution. A traitor from the inside, possibly.
Same way that they resolve things with Salem, basically. They're afraid of all these things, and they find a scapegoat for it. It's all of these people that they accuse of witchcraft. So Hartford witch panic, it's scapegoats. Alice Young may have been a scapegoat for this disease.
So the witch trials started with Alice Young, and by the time they're done in the Connecticut colony, it's another woman who's mostly been lost to history. Her name is Mary Barnes. There is some genealogy information about her, and people today who recognize her as their ancestor and great-grandmother so many times removed. But we don't really know that much about Mary Barnes's trial and how she found herself arrested for witchcraft. We know that she was the wife of Sergeant Thomas Barnes of Farmington and was a mother of 4. At the time of her execution, her daughter Sarah was 12, her son Joseph was 11, there was a son named Benjamin, and a young daughter, Hannah, possibly around 6. We have no depositions. We have no testimony against her. We have the indictment. And one other document that we're going to get to in just a little bit.
Yes. But legal case, we just have the indictment. There's no explanation in the indictment for why she's being charged. It doesn't say, like, you look at indictments in the Salem witch trials and they specify who you were supposed to have afflicted by name. This indictment for Mary Barnes doesn't say that. Having not the fear of God before thine eyes, thou hast entertained familiarity with Satan. So it just accuses her of familiarity with Satan and doesn't accuse her of actually harming somebody with witchcraft.
Josh, I'm finding in these Connecticut records that we do have that the item that they're guilty for does seem to match those 7 things.
The 7, Matthew Perkins started that, but then a lieutenant governor in Connecticut copied that list verbatim and said, these are the 7 reasons why you find somebody suspicious of witchcraft.
And so I'm seeing when I look at these cases that one of those 7 things shows up in the indictment if we have it, or the accusations. That, like Mary's. It's vague, but it's from the list.
Yes. Familiarity with Satan is definitely on the list, because if you can prove that, then you can convict the person of witchcraft just through their knowledge of Satan.
Yeah. So for us to understand what happened to Mary Barnes and the others in Hartford in 1662 and 63, we want to understand that this community had been fracturing for over a decade. And one of the things it started with was the Hartford controversy, or what it's called is the Hartford controversy. Today, they weren't calling it the Hartford controversy.
There was a big rift in Hartford, especially in the church. It was after Thomas Hooker's death in 1647, there was this prolonged religious conflict. Reverend Samuel Stone was pitted against church elders. This was not about abstract theology, but it was a power struggle over the governance of the church. Because Stone favored a Presbyterian model with the minister in charge, while the elders wanted the congregational model with shared authority of the congregation and the minister. And this conflict, like you said, it consumed nearly the entire decade of the 1650s in Hartford. This was a real big deal.
When we spoke with author and historian Paul Moyer, he said the fact that the conflict existed and that it endured through the entire decade of the 1650s meant that by the time 1662 rolls around, you have a very divided community. You have a community with a history of social conflict and lots of animosity. I added that lots and animosity, but it was a lot of animosity.
It was. It's like looking at Salem Village in 1692, this Hartford in 1662 is very similar. Everybody has different feelings about religious matters and they're squabbling all the time.
There's a lot of value in comparing Salem Village and Salem to Hartford and Wethersfield. There were groups of people who were like-minded against other groups of people who were like-minded, but they weren't thinking the same. The church's division, it was going to the General Assembly. They were having to ask pastors to leave. One pastor was asked to leave, and he started his own church in another town. And another thing to consider when we're looking at the Salem witch trials, we look at all these different pastors that cycled through Salem Village. Well, in Wethersfield, you have the same thing. 5 different pastors cycled through in the 1660s alone.
Wow. That's a short lifespan for pastors. Back then, a pastor usually, once you received the call to a certain community, you usually stayed there for the rest of your career.
Well, we've talked about the frontier. We've talked about the religious strife. There's another really important thing to mention.
Well, let's talk about the politics. Who was running the colony in 1662 and 1663? We mentioned John Mason, the deputy governor, but the governor was John Winthrop Jr. He was the son of John Winthrop, the governor for several years of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so John Winthrop Jr. is governor of Connecticut Colony for many years. And just a note of something that comes up later is he has a son named Waitstill Winthrop who gets on the Salem court and is one of the judges of the Salem witch trials. And these 3 generations of men, they did not see eye to eye on witch trials. So John Winthrop Jr., he was an alchemist, a physician, a natural philosopher, and he brought a scientific mindset to witchcraft questions. He was big on physical evidence, not spectral testimony. And under his governance in the late 1650s, a string of executions was stopped because Connecticut Colony, the first 7 people they brought up on witchcraft charges were all found guilty and condemned and hanged. And then John Winthrop started getting involved in cases, first as a physician and then as the governor. And that ball stopped rolling until 1662. And John Winthrop Jr.'s in London getting a new charter for Connecticut and comes back. And, well, he seems to get back to Connecticut in time to stop some of the witch trials, but he doesn't.
He was Connecticut's first elected governor in 1657, but at that time he could only do 1 term, so then he served as the deputy governor. But then they changed the laws and he was the governor again, and he ruled as governor from 1659 to 1676. So the only witch trials that happened during that period happened around the time that he traveled to get the royal charter.
Some other things about John Winthrop Jr., he actually treated Mary Barnes as a physician. He was a physician, and he helped Mary Barnes with some things that we'll touch on later.
So it was really significant when he left for London to secure a royal charter from Charles II, and it was granted. He left in 61. He got the charter in the fall of 62 and was back. And that charter today is at the Connecticut State Library. You can see it. It's remarkable to see the royal charter that Winthrop Jr. brought back for the colony.
Amazing. It's over 360 years old and still well preserved.
So sadly, the last 3 executions of Connecticut did happen during his governorship. It was in 1663. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more.
And in March 1662, while Winthrop was still in London, Two cases set Hartford ablaze with fear. The first one involved an 8-year-old girl named Elizabeth Kelly. In March 1662, she fell ill and died. Very suddenly, unexpectedly, on her deathbed, she accused a neighbor, Goodwife Ayres, of tormenting her. And this led to the arrests of both Goodwife Ayres and her husband, William. And then there was a second young person involved. This was a young woman named Anne Cole who lived next door to a Dutch family. She began experiencing fits of what the community interpreted as diabolical possession. She spoke in a Dutch tone, as they described it, and also unintelligible languages. So she's speaking, they don't understand her. They think at times she's speaking Dutch. She does live next door to this Dutch family, so they could have concluded that, oh, she's a neighbor. She hears this all the time. She could mimic it without knowing what the words mean. But no, people are afraid. They're very afraid. And so that fear causes them to be blind to an obvious fact that she's been exposed to this language for who knows how many years. And she can repeat some of it.
She specifically names her tormentors Rebecca Greensmith and Elizabeth Seeger. And ministers, including Samuel Stone of Hartford, interviewed her during her fits, and they carefully recorded everything she said.
Anne Cole was adjacent to a Dutch family, and she spoke some Dutch or Dutch-like tones. How much of this panic was really about people who were seen as the other? Dutch immigrants in an English Puritan community? People who didn't fit the strict cultural norms? I'm reminded of Salem again. And in Salem, there was a lot of this othering of the French, because the French were the big rivals, colonial rivals with the English in Massachusetts Bay. And so Philip English, even though he's the wealthiest man in Salem, he gets accused and his wife gets accused and they get arrested and they have to pay thousands of pounds to escape, and they lose a bunch of their fortune being confiscated while they're escaped. He's from the Jersey Islands, which is a contested territory between the French and the English, but he's French speaking, even though his name literally means, is English. His French name is Philippe L'Anglais, which just means Philip the English. So he has English ancestry, but he has a French accent. People know that he's from France and they use it against him. And there's other people that get accused of plotting. People with French heritage are accused of plotting against Massachusetts. They're accused of scheming with the French in Canada to undermine the government of Massachusetts Bay. And so in Connecticut, they're afraid of the Dutch. In Massachusetts, they're afraid of the French. And this comes out very clearly in the witch trials.
During these panics, if you're on the margins, that's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah, those who didn't fit the strict norms were at greater risk, whether it was their ethnicity, language, economic status, or something about their personality. If you had a disagreeable personality, people just thought you were always cursing them.
There's so many examples of that. So at the center of the accusations of this panic is Rebecca Greensmith. And her story really tells us a lot about vulnerability and survival and what not to do, by the way. And I don't mean the witchcraft. So Rebecca is a widow 2 times over, had 2 daughters. She's been an independent woman in between those marriages, by the way. By the time she marries Nathaniel, that's her 3rd marriage. She'd also, after she'd widowed twice, she did get to a bit of trouble.
The court fined John Knott for some miscarriage with Rebecca, meaning they weren't behaving the proper way. They might have had a public display of affection or something that was unbecoming for two people that weren't married to each other at that time.
We do know Nathaniel Greensmith was frequently in trouble with the law. He was convicted of stealing a cow and a hog, accused of fighting, lying. But he was relatively a prosperous farmer. They had a home which stood between Wethersfield Lane and Farmington Highway.
And we know that a Reverend Whiting described Rebecca Greensmith as a lewd, ignorant, and considerably aged woman, though she was in her 40s when he says this. So that tells you about the age standards they had back then, that if you're 40s, you're considerably aged. That's a little bit different now where we're living much longer.
Yeah. After the accusations of Ann Cole, she was imprisoned and interrogated by Minister Haynes and Whiting. And she did initially resist. She didn't immediately confess. This really reminds me of the experience Tituba might have been having when she's basically cornered and drilled with questions, leading questions. Why did you hurt the children? Maybe they said this to Rebecca as well. She told a visitor that this experience, it felt like flesh had been pulled from her bones. It was so exhausting, intimidating, and just emotionally excruciating. She eventually confessed. I would consider under great psychological pressure.
I'd definitely say she was under some duress because the ministers they're your role model. They're, the pinnacle of this Puritan society in Connecticut. The ministers are really so well respected and they're authorities. And if they're basically telling you that you've done something and they keep badgering you with it, eventually, you just go along with what they want you to say. But in her confession, she talks specifically about a Christmas party. She actually mentions that on Christmas, they're going to have a merry meeting with the devil near a river, and there's dancing and drinking sack, fortified wine. And they shouldn't have been having this according to a lot of their neighbors because Christmas celebrations were banned by Puritans. They were legally banned in Massachusetts for many years, and in Connecticut, basically it was not considered a good thing to do. So you would have got some heat from neighbors and maybe your minister.
It was seen as Catholic corruption, and the Puritans feared the Catholics.
Yeah, Christmas is not set out as a day to celebrate in the Bible. Whereas you have certain holy days enumerated, like Passover and some other days specifically mentioned in the Bible, there's nothing in there telling you to celebrate Christmas. So they banned it. They wanted only things that directly had this biblical foundation.
In this specific merry meeting, the authorities basically twisted it into a gathering of witches or a witches' Sabbath. They had her describing it, and she claimed, yes, the devil was there. He appeared as a deer, as a fawn. And she said that she promised to be ready to respond to his call. So what was friends getting together, having some Christmas cheer and dance, turned into a witches' Sabbath?
They turned it satanic. It's, a 1662 satanic panic. They're like, oh, they're out in the woods doing this like ritual thing, so they must be worshiping Satan. Sounds familiar from the 1980s.
This is also a precursor to the naming of witches in 1692 because she gave them a guest list. She told them who was there. she named the network of evildoers. And she named her husband, Nathaniel Greensmith, Elizabeth Seeger, who happens to be indicted on the same day as Mary Barnes. Now, Mary Barnes is not named here, but Mary Sanford, Judith Ayers, James Wakely, Peter Grant's wife, Catherine Palmer, and Judith Varlett. Do you think she understood the consequences of what she was doing? Well, first of all, we know she didn't because she felt like flesh was being pulled from her bones. That's describing physical pain. If you're in physical pain, you want it to stop, for one, and you don't have a calm demeanor on actual circumstances around you necessarily. I've had pain. I know what it's like when pain is heightened, your emotions are heightened, and you just want relief. So, the Salem witch trials hadn't happened. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think she realized all the court that was going to happen for all these people?
At this point in Connecticut history, they had executed those 7 people for witchcraft. In 1662, they did execute Mary Sanford, but that's after the confession. So at the time she makes the confession, all she has to go on really is those first 7 executions in the colony. Mary Johnson in 1648 did confess, and she was hanged. So we know that people who confessed were hanged before Rebecca Greensmith testified. And we know that Rebecca's in Hartford in 1648 when Mary Johnson is executed there. So chances are very, very good that she heard that story. It would be really weird if she hadn't in 14 years heard that story of you confess, they hang you.
Yeah. So you mentioned Mary Sanford is indicted in June and hanged. Winthrop Jr. is definitely not in town for that. But some of the others were able to get out from underneath the accusations. William and Judith Ayers fled to New York.
And James Wakely fled to Rhode Island. He abandoned both his wife and all of his property, his whole estate, left it in Connecticut.
Henry and Catherine Palmer fled to Rhode Island.
Now, Judith Varlett, she had a hookup. She had a special connection. She was arrested, but she was released because her brother-in-law was the governor of New Netherland, Peter Stuyvesant, and he personally intervened, writing a letter to the judges in Connecticut testifying on her behalf. He testified to her good character, and she left and went to New York. So the people in Connecticut were satisfied she's gone. And then she's satisfied that she's alive. So it shows powerful connections could save you.
If they were powerful enough.
Powerful enough is the measure, yes.
Yeah. So Andrew Sanford, he didn't hang with his wife. They acquitted him.
Yeah. Hang the woman, acquit the man.
Yeah.
Familiar trend.
Now, I find Elizabeth Seeger's case so interesting because there's lots of gossip and details on her. And Cole's saying so much about her. Rebecca Greensmith is saying so much about her. She's recorded as saying so many things. She's indicted and convicted, but then reprieved. And interestingly, Mary Barnes, the one we don't know who named her. We don't know what the accusation was other than what you said. The indictment read, which was her familiarity with the devil. But Elizabeth, she was not a quiet woman. She argued in the courts. She got off. She was not executed at the time that Rebecca Greensmith, Nathaniel Greensmith, and Mary Barnes were executed. I want to know why. I wish we knew why.
She was in court 3 times for this witchcraft charge. She's tried twice in 1663 and acquitted, and then they come after her the 3rd time in 65 and convict But like you said, she gets reprieved and released, and she's free to go.
Mary Barnes really is the mystery victim. We have this one indictment from January 6, 1663. That's a couple of months after the governor is back. That indictment states that she pleaded not guilty, but the jury found her guilty. There's no depositions, there's no testimony, just this indictment. We don't know what the accuser said. We don't know what triggered the suspicion. We don't know if she was not well liked. Is there anything else we know about her?
Yeah, we know that she lived in New Haven for a time and then moved to Farmington. We know that in 1655, this couple in New Haven, the Baileys, is accused of witchcraft. And what comes out in some of the testimony is stories of Thomas Barnes hunting for ducks. I think he killed a pig also. And the neighbors, the Baileys, were very upset about him killing these animals. So that testimony doesn't directly say that it was the Barneses who accused the Baileys, but it leads you to believe that maybe they were among the accusers of the Baileys.
It does lead you to think that because their indictment called them liars. So they were getting in trouble for witchcraft for lying.
And the Baileys, what happened to them is they basically got expelled from New Haven and they moved to Hartford. And so they're in Hartford. Mary Barnes is in Farmington, which touches Hartford. And this in 1662, this is where they're at. So Hartford witch panic. How does this couple from Farmington get involved? Maybe it's this connection, but
yeah, our researchers out there, help us out. Let's find some more documents.
Yeah, if you have an answer to did the Barneses accuse the Baileys and did the Baileys accuse the Barneses, we really want to know that.
Yeah. There is one other interesting thing that we know about her, and it brings Governor Winthrop back into the story. And we talked about his role as a physician in the community. Many community members would go see him for treatment. We know that Alice Young's husband, John Young, went to Winthrop Jr. for treatment because in those medical records, Winthrop noted that John Young's wife had been hanged for witchcraft. His records are very interesting.
Yeah, he was one of only 3 people who wrote down that Alice Young was the one hanged for witchcraft in 1647.
So before the witch panic in Hartford, Mary Barnes is being seen by John Winthrop Jr. for a medical exam. And there is an original document recording this. Unfortunately, his medical journals are not professionally transcribed yet. But our colleague, Mary Bingham, has examined them, and she found Mary Barnes was one of his patients.
This record, the paper it's on is fragile and the ink faded, and the handwriting is in John Winthrop Jr.'s 17th century script. So it requires a paleographer to come in and read it properly, somebody who's trained in reading old handwriting.
Yeah, they're trained in reading and interpreting historical handwriting. And these documents really are different from modern writing. Sometimes they use different letter formations. They love abbreviations. For instance, on this one, it says Hart for Hartford, H-A-R-T. Lots of different ways to spell. And it takes time and expertise to decipher them. But this particular document is so precious because there's so little known about Mary Barnes. And so I'm so grateful that we know a little bit more about her, that a doctor in her community cared about her well-being. It was a paid transaction too. It was a real doctor's visit. He was paid for his medical expertise.
Yeah, and basically one thing that he would do as this a trained physician treating people around the colony, people would write him letters and describe their conditions, and he would write back his prescriptions. So he did a lot of his doctoring by mail. But here was the governor of Connecticut, a trained physician and natural philosopher, also an alchemist, and he's treating Mary Barnes for what he understood as a medical condition. This document shows treatments, measurements, costs. There's a doctor and patient relationship here. And later, following his absence in London, the same woman that he had treated, whose ailment he had tried to address through medicine and science, whose life he was once trying to preserve, now she's accused of supernatural crimes and hanged.
And it's just so sad to me that we don't know why. Why was she an alleged witch?
Primary source documents like this are so critical. They're the voices of people who can't speak for themselves anymore. And we have a responsibility to listen to what they're telling us.
The silence in historical records about these women, these accused witches, effectively erase people like Mary Barnes and Alice Young, erase them as people. And we're left with this absence where a life story should be.
And we just try to hold on to the name and preserve, the essence of the person, even if we don't understand who they were, really. Try to continue carrying on their name and what we do know.
So here, basically the bookends of the Connecticut witch trials. Alice Young, we know so little. Mary Barnes, we know so little. So whatever we can put together from the middle, from the history between 47 and 63, we have to take a really good look at it.
Yeah. And let's talk about what the aftermath was for Mary's family after she's executed. She was imprisoned for 3 weeks, and Thomas has to pay the jail fees. Comes out to 21 shillings. But then 3 months after she's hanged, he's signing a prenuptial agreement to marry a Mary Andrews. And the terms of this agreement state that they're going to put out all of the children. In other words, send them to other houses to work for people, except for Benjamin. They're going to keep Benjamin. But Sarah, who's 12, and Joseph's 11, they're sent away to be servants in other people's homes. Hannah, 6 at the time, she died less than a year after her mother's execution.
He remarried 3 months later and sent his grieving children away. And this is really one of those moments where you stop and you have to recognize there's going to be 2 sides to every story. There is. There's Thomas's side. There's Mary Barnes' side. We don't really have that much information. But when we're looking at these histories, we have to make room for both sides of the story.
Yeah. And Thomas, today we look at this and we're like, 3 months after his wife is hanged, he's already remarrying. But at the time, it was more or less essential for people to be married, to have children, so that their households could be run. And it took people working closely together to support themselves. You couldn't just do everything on your own. So it wasn't unusual to see people remarry very quickly after the death of their spouse, even if their spouse was executed.
When we look at the lives of Elizabeth Seeger and Catherine Harrison, those are 2 of the women who experienced multiple court hearings and accusations and indictments, but survived. They were not hanged. How did that happen?
With Harrison specifically, we know that John Winthrop Jr. asked for ministers to give advice on how to proceed with the case, because when she was first tried, there was no verdict. There's no jury verdict, so they try her again. She gets convicted, but she gets reprieved because this commission basically says no more spectral evidence. We need 2 witnesses to any act of witchcraft or it doesn't count.
Curiosity of who these victims were often bring descendants and community members into Connecticut looking for where they can pay tribute and visit a memorial for the witchcraft victims of Connecticut. There is not a memorial that represents the 11 hanged or those accused. There are some individuals. Alice Young has a brick in Windsor. Lydia Gilbert has a brick in Windsor. Mary Barnes has a brick at the Ancient Burying Ground in Hartford.
Yeah, and all of the victims were absolved in May 2023 by the Connecticut General Assembly when it passed Resolution HJ 34. It cleared the 11 hanged by name and Elizabeth Seeger as someone who was convicted for a time. And it names all of those who were indicted, whether they were tried or not, because they were arrested and they suffered at the hands of the colonial authorities because of these false accusations. And so this resolution acknowledged their innocence and recognized the injustice that was done to them and the various ways that the victims and their families paid a price just for being named as witches.
Right now, you can talk about these stories. You can purchase books. Some books have information about the Connecticut witch trials that you need to know. Be learning these stories and histories and sharing them. Make this an important history to Connecticut and to the world. It's just as valuable. These lives were just as important as the women and men who were hanged in Salem. They died because of the same injustice. But we don't feel as comfortable or familiar with the Connecticut history yet. But we can. We can do better.
We'll be back next week with more from The Thing About Witch Hunts. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep remembering. And have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.